Coming up on Chasing the Natty, the spring portal window has opened and we'll be breaking down who all has entered and how it is going to impact the CFF 2024 season moving forward. In addition to that, we had another round of spring games given to us this weekend, and we'll touch on a few of the most interesting games today, with more coming to you later this week. We've got all that and more coming right after this.
GT go, breaks the tackle, he's 10, he's touchdown! Cook's gonna throw the deep ball, and Burton past the defense! Touchdown, Luther Burton! Milroe gonna run it again, got a lane, kicked in the turbo, Milroe! Goodbye, touchdown, Bama!
This is Chasing the Natty, a college fantasy football podcast. All right, welcome in everyone. This is Jared Palmgren, host of the Chasing the Natty podcast. I hope you guys are having a wonderful ride to your work on this Monday morning. We are the College Fantasy Football Podcast on the Campus of Canton Podcast Network. You can find us on all of your podcast feeds and on YouTube every Monday morning during the off season at 6 a.m. sharp. If you want to support the great work we are doing here, head on over to campuscanton.com and subscribe there with one of our fantastic tiers. We have content ranging on all sorts of things for the college fantasy games, whether it is college fantasy itself, Devi, C2C, college IDP, college DFS. Basically, if you play it, we've got content, whether that's tools, rankings, everything you need to succeed. If you want to get in touch for whatever reason, you can find me and the show on Twitter. I am at CFF_Jared. The show is at Chasing the Natty, and the handsome fellow across from me got jealous of his co-host being brought on last week and made sure he got on this week. That is Mr. Austin Nace at Devi Deeds, host of the Campus Life podcast and founder of CampusCanton.com. Austin, how you doing today, man?
Yeah, true story. I had demanded to come on after you had Colin on last week. I was like, you're just letting anybody on the show again. I'm like a bad penny. I turn up on here like once or twice a year. And so I figured I can't do any worse than he did last week. This is the perfect week for me to come on and talk college fantasy. Full disclosure, as I do at the beginning of every time I'm on, I am not a CFF analyst.
You are slowly but surely becoming one. You come onto this show enough times, and you get better every time you come on here, Dawson. Don't sell yourself short. You're an incredibly smart guy. Well, and Campus Life is slowly but surely turning into a second CT or CFF show for the Campus Canton Podcast Network.
Oh yeah, the fun thing about C2C leagues is like it's almost like the the decathlon or whatever, where you kind of have like the things that you're better at, and like that's how like some of those guys like get their points. You might be stronger in one event, and that's kind of what C2C leagues are like. But I am trying to improve my CFF knowledge, as improve a little bit in that category.
Oh, I will fully admit that in the one C2C league that I play in, it is basically a CFF Dynasty league to me for the most part. Now, granted, part of it is because we don't actually have NFL teams on that league yet. It's one of the ones where we're letting the players kind of filter in first, and then like 2 years in, we'll do an NFL draft. So you kind of are forced to play the Devi side a little bit, but I'm not good at NFL Dynasty nearly as much, or at least I think I can draft a pretty solid team once that time comes, and I can just focus on winning the college side for right now. I did pretty well last year, except my quarterbacks kind of fell apart as the year finished there. But enough of me talking about my league, Austin. We got a great show ahead here. We're going to talk about the transfer portal. The spring window has opened. We've had a couple of big names enter, so we'll get into some of that. And then we got another round of spring games, some takeaways we have from there. So a lot of great stuff. So going back to the spring portal here, Austin, were you one of the people like myself who was kind of buying into the smoke of this portal season was going to be absolutely nuts? Because full disclosure, again, I bought into it. I'm like, okay, it's the second year where this is like this, spring designated spring portal era or period would be in full effect. And I remember last year, I was like, like the spring portal last year, like there were like a couple big names, like obviously like Jordan Addison coming in, right? Where like they came in or they entered the portal. But for the most part, the spring portal was like a lot quieter. But there were certain big names out there who I'm not going to disparage anybody, but there are some big names in college football that were hinting at the fact that this spring portal was going to be just as crazy as like the winter portal when the portal window opened up back then. And not that we haven't had some big names, obviously, like David Martinez, Penny Boone going back in, things like that, but it's still, I'd say, pretty quiet compared to what we had in the fall. Fall, it felt like the whole college football was getting turned on its head with different players moving to different places and everything. Do you kind of feel the same way, or do you think this is like it's crazier than it appears? I guess is.
I mean, for what it is, I actually think there's some decently big names in there. I mean, Damian Martinez, you were going to talk Jaden Rashada a little bit, was like a borderline 5-star guy last year. Like there are definitely some good players that I don't think 3, 4, 5 years ago we would have gotten in the portal. But yeah, I mean, I think it's always overblown. And honestly, like you said, you didn't want to, shame anybody. Like I think some of the people that say, this is going to be a big one of the people that like their careers depend on like the hype of the portal and like making announcements about players. Maybe they work it on 3 and they do all the edits for all the players. Not to name any names, that just could be an example of a person who might be guilty of doing some hyping. So I think like those were the people that were kind of like hyping it up a little bit. But I mean, there's some really interesting names in here as we're going to talk about, and for one reason or another, they're in the portal.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that people have to remember is I think there definitely was a lot of smoke that, of course, teams are tampering all over the place, right? Like that's the kind of information that these guys are getting. And, they're keeping the back of my mind of like, okay, it's a 50-50 shot whether certain players enter the portal. And so I think the two things to kind of keep in mind there is that one, I think we underestimate how well a lot of these schools are able to retain their players. Like most of these guys who are like leaving for quote unquote better opportunities, whether that's an NIL reason or playing time and everything, they want to give the team that they're on at least one final chance to really kind of show like, hey, am I going to get playing time this year? Are you going to take care of me NIL wise? Maybe it's a walk-on who needs some NIL to cover a scholarship that they don't have or things like that. They want to give the team they're on at least one more chance. And a lot of times those schools, if they do truly value the player, will have kind of a leg up in those negotiations and say like, okay, yeah, if we can just meet where you're asking, you'll stay. And so a lot of those guys that would have entered the portal, that were rumored to enter the portal, end up sticking around because of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think NIL is something that you can point to and blame for guys entering the portal has actually been overstated a little bit overall. I think generally a lot of these guys are just not very good at assessing their own skill level as it relates to the roster that they're headed to, the depth chart that they're headed to, and the coaching staff that they're headed to. I think that is like a large portion of these guys. So kind of using NIL, it's like easy to point to when you lose a guy that you like from your favorite team. But I don't think that's the reason a lot of these guys are moving rosters right now.
Well, I think another thing you have to remember is that playing time and NIL are intrinsically tied together, right? It's hard to sell yourself for NIL opportunities if you're not the guy actually out there on the field, right? And so that again, so it's like yes, there's a little bit of NIL involved, but really, like you said, it comes down to more playing time than anything else. The other thing I think we have to keep in mind with the spring portal and it being more muted than I think a lot of people were kind of expecting can't speak today. We're only a week in. We still have pretty much a whole week here where guys still have time to put their names in because all they have to do is enter their names by the 30th. They don't actually have to have landed at a spot yet. And so, again, going back to my point about how a lot of these guys are still on their teams, they're still in that negotiation phase with their current teams. We'll see how those kind of break down over the next week here. Because if you remember, in the last couple of spring portal windows, like you had Jordan Addison, who entered like right before the spring portal window closed. Adonai Mitchell last year for Georgia entered like the day before the spring portal closed. Like, again, they have the opportunities they give their own teams the opportunities, but if that doesn't come through and everything, that's when you kind of see some of these guys enter in at the last minute.
And I would assume that, I played small, like Division III college soccer, not D1 football, but after spring season was over, like the week after was always, you kind of had like meetings set up with the coach and you'd go in and kind of talk about how spring went, where they think you are on the depth chart. So I'm assuming a lot of these guys are still kind of doing that this week with all the games that just happened. So yeah, I think we'll still probably hear of a couple of meaningful players entering the portal.
Alrighty. I said we go ahead and actually start talking about some of these players here, Austin. But before we do that, I can give a quick announcement. Again, just a quick little reminder to everybody that if you have not already, go check out the latest episode of Defending the Natty with myself and Nate Marquise, where we did talk about some of the freshmen that you hear about in some of these spring games, but also, quite frankly, part of me wishes we had waited till afterwards because there's a lot of freshmen that broke out during these games, could be impactful for later, but still a great show overall. About 2 hours worth of us discussing some instant impact guys for college fantasy, some guys to stash for later, and some guys that are ranked pretty highly at 247, at on 3, in our own Campus to Canton guy that me and Nate are fading. Because we just don't like the situation nearly as much because, again, maybe the C2C guide rates him highly for Devy purposes, but sorry, I'm not drafting Jaden Davis and in any of my CFF Dynasty leagues because that's just not what Michigan produces for us. Although he could be a good NFL quarterback one day, but we'll see. That's enough of the announcements. Let's go talk about some of these transfer players. And what's going to happen here today is that if we went one by one through all of these guys, Austin and I would be here until 12 o'clock at night. And to give you an idea, that's about 8.5 hours from now. So we're going to take these in groups of 5. I got 5 quarterbacks, 10 running backs, and 5 wide receivers that we'll discuss today. But again, I'm going to kind of run through them real quick, and then Austin and I will pick out maybe 2 to 3 that are really worth talking about on each page. So we'll go ahead and get started with the quarterbacks. And probably the biggest one is Jaden Rashada, the quarterback out of Arizona State, formerly committed before that to Florida before he flipped his recruiting over there. Four-star quarterback, borderline 5-star quarterback, was, again, getting tons of NIL opportunities coming out of high school. Like I said, eventually landed with Kenny Dillingham. Started his true freshman year last year before getting hurt pretty early on in the season. Ended up saving his red shirt, just to give you an idea of how early he was hurt. And now, after spring has come along, he is in the portal, basically leaving Sam Leavitt to be the presumptive starter over there at Arizona State. Technically, Trenton Bourget might get the first snaps of the fall and everything like that, but pretty much, I think even Kenny Dillingham said recently in an interview that if the season started today, he probably would go ahead and start Sam Leavitt over there. So Rashada's out. He is headed out. The rumored destination there is Georgia, but he's also taking a look at Mississippi State and Auburn. Couple of other smaller names here. Probably the rest of these quarterbacks I don't see as really big time guys moving forward in terms of their impact for CFF, but worth talking about regardless. Kyle Kelly, the quarterback at Ball State, dual threat guy. A lot of us liked his potential in the MAC, but he is now losing out to redshirt freshman Caden Samoza over there. So he is out. Colin Schlee leaving UCLA after the whole Chip Kelly debacle. Apparently he's trying to head back to the East Coast where his home is, around Maryland. We haven't heard an actual school there. Utah State gets a double whammy here, losing Cooper Legas and McKay Hillstead, the 2 starting quarterbacks they had last year. Both of them enter in the portal after the spring here. And last but not least, backup quarterback Jacoby Criswell out of Arkansas also enters the portal. So, Austin, I guess there's really no other place to start except for Jaden Rashada. I know our recruiting team liked him last year. Has anything really changed over the last couple of years with him? Or last year with him, excuse me.
Yeah, so I would say our recruiting team didn't like him very much. I believe we had him as our QB 18 in our guide, which was significantly lower than what his ranking was by the services. There were a lot of issues. He actually reminded me, it was really funny, after his junior year, I did a Twitter thread that is out there still, where I comped him to Jaden Daniels. I said, as like a high schooler, they're very similar, like way too aggressive downfield, need to learn to rein it in. Probably needs to go sit a year. Not as good of a rusher as Daniels is, but that was kind of the player that I and from a build perspective, he's tall, really lanky. And then he went to Arizona State, and I was like, that's kind of weird. And then he probably had to play too early, kind of like Jaden Daniels did. I don't think Rashada was ready at all. I've talked about this with, we were talking about this before the show. Colin and I have talked about this. He really needs to sit a year or two. He needed to go someplace where there was some experienced weapons to kind of make his life a little bit easier, because he's not the kind of quarterback today that can do that. And then he got thrown into basically the worst situation possible. I do think, I think Georgia's too lofty for him. You mentioned Georgia is kind of a landing spot for him. I hate to kind of Like, I think a school that is comparable to Arizona State from like a program prestige perspective would actually be fine, where he can go and not be forced to start right away. I don't really have, like a TCU
Mississippi
level
State.
school, SMU level school, Mississippi State would be cool. Like one of those kind of, mid low end P5 teams that's every few years has a good run. I think that would be the kind of place he can go. I don't think he's like a buy right now. I think he's like at least a year or two away. And I think last year was actually a setback for him overall.
I definitely agree. Again, it was a big risk that Kenny Dillingham took last year, where he kind of took the baptism by fire approach, saying like, throw Rashada out there. Our other guys aren't getting us anywhere. Yes, Rashada's not quite ready, but like we're not doing anything this year regardless. So let him go out there, make the mistakes. Well, not only did he get injured, but he looked pretty bad in the couple of games that he did start. And so you now make him lose a ton of time that he would have normally gotten for sitting back, being the backup, learning the playbook, nailing down his mechanics, loses all that. I think at Georgia, it makes a lot of sense because he is a guy that, based on what I saw out of high school and like with like coming out with recruiting and everything, there's a pretty high ceiling here if Rashada can put it all together. And so going to a place like Georgia, right? Carson Beck's your starter this year. Gunnar Stockton's going to be the QB2 more than likely, but Rashada is talented enough to push a guy like Stockton to make him better. And also, it allows Rashada to really kind of take that weight off his shoulder. He knows he doesn't have to get out there anytime soon. He can really focus on his mechanics, really focus on kind of putting it all together. And if he can't put it all together, he is a guy that could challenge Gunnar Stockton that very next year for the starting gig at Georgia. But again, that's all very big ifs, right? So, an interesting name, but I agree with you. Pretty much this shoots down any potential CFF value that he would have had this year. Even the other two schools he's looking at, Auburn, Mississippi State, those schools have their starters in Peyton Thorne and Blake Shapen. He was going to sit behind those guys regardless. He's pretty much done for this year. Cooper Legas and McKay Hillstead, we'll kind of talk about a little bit later when we do the Utah State spring game. Austin, from a C2C's perspective, Jacoby Criswell, man, like this is a guy that, according to Mac Brown, was like on par with Drake May for a whole offseason, and completely different trajectories these two went since that quarterback battle. You had Drake May now set to be a top 3 pick in the NFL draft this year, and Jacoby Criswell is now probably going to be on his 3rd school here. So I guess really the question is, what happened?
Yeah, I was talking earlier about guys that tend to not be very good about assessing their own talent as it relates to the depth chart around them as they're making school decisions. I think Criswell, we joked on at least one of the shows that I'm on here on the network when this happened, like when he made that transfer, he was like, I'm going to the portal. Like he couldn't beat out Drake May, that there's no shame in that. And he was like, I want to go find somewhere to play right away. And then he went to Arkansas, where he's like just kind of a slightly probably worse version of KJ Jefferson, who they already had there, who probably wasn't leaving anytime soon. And that's just one of those where it's like, buddy, like, what do you like? If you actually wanted to go play somewhere, this was just not the move. I am still actually really interested in him. And I do think a mid-tier G5 school could be really, really interesting. I don't know exactly who is going to be sniffing around the portal, especially for quarterback. And I think it's especially difficult because, for a quarterback, especially, you probably wanted that guy there during spring to kind of start digesting the playbook, get to know his receivers and, the linemen, and get acclimated to the school, the locker room, all those kinds of things. So, I think that hurts him. But I do think if there's a place out there that, like, I think he would be cool. I don't know how much they want to run the quarterback at like UCLA, but I do think he could go there and maybe like challenge for something depending on what they want there. But I think, a G5 landing spot's more likely. And I think he could be really intriguing if he ends up somewhere that's, got an opening and will kind of let him unleash.
Yeah, I would agree with you for the most part. And I think that's kind of the case with a lot of these quarterbacks here with Kyle Kelly, Colin Schlee, Jacoby Criswell, and Legas and Hillstead. All of them kind of fall into this category of, I don't think any of them are really going to end up doing anything for CFF this year because so many schools pretty much already know who their starter is going to be. And none of these guys really strike me as guys you bring in as like, I don't like the options we have. Let's just bring in the safe pick. Kelly, Schlee, Criswell, none of these guys are safe plays for a school to bring in and be like, okay, if all else fails, it's got to be an okay starter for us. These guys are all guys you bring in. You're like, okay, well, now we just have another competitor in our room. Maybe they win the job, maybe they don't. Just a lot of risk involved.
And how many schools, like you said, that really are kind of probably still competing? You have people competing for that job. You're talking about some of the places that that what's his name from Miami has been rumored to, Jacuri, like
Yep.
the Georgia Southerns, the in Georgia State, the Jacksonville State, like those are the kind of school that I think you'd be looking at if you wanted to send them someplace that was great for us.
Yeah, but again, these guys never listen to what's great for us, so we'll see. All right, let's go talk about the running backs. The running backs is really, I would say, the core of the transfer portal news. This is where kind of some of the biggest names have been involved with. We actually have some guys that we were kind of wondering for a while what their transfer destinations were going to be that actually finally found some transfer destinations. So I'll probably start with those guys first before we get into some of the names that have now entered the portal. Rashad Amos, the former running back out of South Carolina and then afterwards Miami of Ohio, he finally found his destination. There's a lot of smoke to maybe North Carolina. There was some talk about him going to Arizona. Well, he has now landed at Mississippi State, which, to be fair, a place that needed some running backs. Like, they only had Simeon Price. I forget the other guy's name that they had there. Is Seth Davis still there? Forget. It's like Simeon Price and Seth Davis. One of them transferred out. I can't remember off the top of my head. Regardless, that tells you how much I know about this running back room and what they have there in Starksville. And so this, I think, is a pretty solid opportunity for Rashad Amos to come in and potentially get a starting job here. But we'll see. And then the other kind of big name that finally found his spot was a guy we thought we knew where he was committed to, but he flipped his commit here because he wasn't coming in until the summer. And it looks like he's got himself a new place to go. And that is Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt, the former running back out of New Mexico. He is now headed to Ole Miss instead of Arizona. We've been kind of wondering if Ole Miss would be in the market for a running back after Quinshon Judkins left at the end of the last portal session. You had Ulysses Bentley there. You had Kedrick Riscano. Merritt comes in, and I don't know, Austin, like, I guess we'll start with Merritt first, because this is where I've had the most discussion over the last weekend regarding his transfer destination. Is Merritt good enough to come in and be the starter for Ole Miss? Like, obviously, he had a great year last year, 189 carries, over 1,000 yards, 17 touchdowns. But that was the Mountain West. He's coming into the SEC now. You got Ulysses Bentley there, who's been there for about 3 years now. Kedrick Riscano, a guy that I know you liked last year coming out of that freshman class. What's your assessment of this Ole Miss backfield?
Yeah, I mean, I think this probably makes me a little worried about some of the Riscano love that I'd had, likely not impressing, even though they definitely just needed a body here. I mean, I think Diggs blew out his knee at the very end of the season.
Yes.
Like, I think the likelihood of him contributing at all this year is pretty slim.
I wouldn't
overall.
count on it.
So, like, I mean, after that, they just need bodies here. They've got, like you said, Ulysses Bentley, who I don't think very highly of him. I think SEC is like above his level. It could be above Ja'Cory's, Krosky-Merritt's level too. I'm not really sure. So I think this backfield is going to be a mess. It's not one that I'm like actively targeting. I think a lot of rushing production, especially from a touchdown perspective, might actually just be Jackson Dart anyway. He can certainly do a lot of that in the red zone. I could see him having a very high, a lot of 2 to 5 yard touchdown runs this year. I think that's more likely to happen. I'm not buying any of these guys, but I do think this is interesting. And I think of the running backs a dime a dozen, this is a place that he could go and play a decent amount right away.
I think absolutely he'll play a decent amount right away, but like, I just don't know, like, his ADP at Arizona was in the 15th round of CFF drafts. I can't imagine it not going up at this point because of people not believing in this Ole Miss backfield already. Like, even Ulysses Bentley, who we presume would be the starter before they went and got somebody, was going like past the 20th round in a lot of drafts. So clearly people were like of the mindset that he's not the answer there. So Merritt will probably... Go
I've
ahead.
done 6 best balls, I think, this year, and those two names you just mentioned are guys that I literally haven't been interested in at all. I don't think I would have cared how far they really fell. I just think like Quali Conley's a better player at Arizona, and new coaching staff, all that kind of stuff there, and then Ulysses Bentley, we know what he is. So I think this is a positive move for Corey Krosky-Merritt. Just sure, maybe something good could come of this for him. And
I just don't know if he'll return the value that people want him to have. Like if they start drafting him, obviously everybody understands he's not Quinshon Judkins. But if his ADP starts creeping up into like the top 10 rounds, like I just don't know how he returns that value.
that's yucky.
To me he strikes me as another piece in a committee, right? Because again, you got Ulysses Bentley, he's got his own skill set. Riscano's a pretty big dude. He should be able to again, hopefully, fingers crossed, he'll actually get some workload here in the second year. And then Krosky-Merritt, big dude, but like I just don't know if I can expect him to come up and take a workhorse role in an SEC offense in year one at the very least. So who knows?
For sure.
What about Rashad Amos? What's your thoughts process here with him landing at Mississippi State?
I've been pretty distrustful of Mississippi State all offseason just because year one, new coaching staff, that roster was nuked last year, and it's 2 previous coaching staffs had completely disparate opinions of what the offense should look like. So that meant that the style of player that they had on the team was from 2 different guys looking at 2 different, kind of preferences. So I've been very distrustful. It sounds like they had a pretty good, like the offense looked pretty good in the spring game. Overall here, and that's probably because their defense also wasn't very good. I'm tending not to buy the running game this year. If I'm going to buy any pieces of this team, I think it's going to be the passing offense. So I probably don't really care that Rashad Amos is going here, but again, good for him. Like I think if he was going to go to a place and be a starter or a significant contributor, this is one of the few places that had a spot for him. So good for him.
I agree. It really did seem like he took his time to find his landing spot as a place where he could actually, do well. Like, clearly he wanted to get out of the MAC. He felt like he was a tier above, and quite frankly, if you look at his performance last year, he was right. Like he looked incredible down the stretch for Miami of Ohio there. So I don't blame him for trying to move back up to the SEC. But in terms of am I willing to draft him quite yet? Probably not quite there again, but he goes late enough to where you're talking about like 18th round at the earliest, easily getting into the mid 20s. So
well, the question in that range starts becoming, right, like, do I want to try to take a guy that's probably a starter in a situation that's not very good, or like a handcuff that if something happens, like this guy's value spikes? I guess it probably depends on what you've already drafted to that point. If you've got some pretty good guys, this is probably not the bucket of player that you're necessarily reaching into, right?
I would definitely agree with that. Again, we're not going to go one by one through every single player from here on out, but again, this page is just full of guys that I think are worth extensively talking about it a little bit. So we'll go with Damian Martinez next, probably the crown jewel of the transfer portal class at any position, really, let alone just offensive players in general here. I mean, it's sad for Oregon State fans because it really looked like he was going to do the whole, I'm sticking with the team thing. And then spring portal comes around. He's like, holy crap, we are bad. Holy crap, this school is screwed. I'm not going to get the connections I need if I stay here. So he has already made it very clear which schools he's pretty much putting at the top of the list, which is great for us in terms of understanding where his impact could be moving forward. We're talking about Miami, Mississippi State again. Seems like they're in the portal for grabbing another running back potentially aside from Amos, Kentucky, and Arizona. So those are the 4 schools right there. It seems like of the bunch, Miami is being the most aggressive in terms of trying to get Martinez out of the portal. They're not even waiting for Martinez to go on his visit to them. They said, screw you, we're coming to you. They made an in-home visit to him in Texas. So of those schools there, Austin, between Miami, Mississippi State, Kentucky, Arizona, which one would excite you the most?
I have some maybe unfounded skepticism on a couple of these situations. Like, I think everyone points to Miami as a good spot, and I think of this group, it probably is the best. But and this is what's confusing about this, because Miami actually has like a fairly decent amount of guys there in that backfield, but they've been continuously looking for like a guy, like quote in quotes in caps, a guy. So Is that like, would Damian Martinez actually go there and be like a bell cow? I'm not 100%. I'm not 100% sold on that. And I think if we're talking about Kentucky, I don't think he would be a bell cow there. Mississippi State, maybe, but again, it's just not a good. It's probably a comparable situation to Oregon State with a much more difficult schedule, like just quite frankly. And Arizona, like I just don't know what to make of Arizona this year overall. I'm kind of a little sketched out by Arizona. So like I guess Miami is probably the best of those four, but I don't feel as good as some people have about like, oh, if he goes there, just lock him into the same volume he was going to get at Oregon State. I'm not entirely sure that I find that to be accurate, especially with how good I think their passing game will also be this year. They won't need to lean on him as much.
I mean, like, Miami's running back situation is pretty screwy right now. They lose Henry Parrish. He's in the portal, which is probably another guy we could have listed here, but the rumor was he was going back to Ole Miss, but then like I feel like if that was the case, he would have already committed there, especially with them grabbing Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt. It seems like that they've got their guy now, so where does that leave Parrish? Javonte Citizen, we'll talk about him in a second. Like, he's out. In their spring game, the fact that their two starting running backs were a former tight end and a true freshman in Chris Johnson, a guy that, we like, don't get me wrong, like he's a talented dude. Like they're in a pretty tight spot. Again, Mark Fletcher's coming back from injury. He should be okay by the time it gets back to the fall, but like I can totally see why they would just go and grab a guy like Damian Martinez, ride him, let Mark Fletcher just coast this year, let him recover, and then in his third year, his money year, let him take on that full workload after Damian Martinez leaves this year. I am the opposite of you. If he goes to Miami, I am kind of okay with locking him into the same workload he got at Oregon State, given the fact that just everything behind him is very, very variable, I guess is the best way to say it. Because like again, you're talking about a true freshman, a guy that's a tight end who's moving to the running back position, but a lot of guesswork to go on there. And honestly, like I kind of had this thought to myself as well, where I think him going to Miami might even be safer than what he had at Oregon State, right? Because like Oregon State, like you said, they got absolutely gutted. The schedule was pretty solid. Again, going against Mountain West competition is great and all, but again, if that O-line doesn't hold up, given all that they lost over there, the best running backs can be hampered by a terrible O-line. I think going to Miami and the level of talent they have surrounding him there could honestly might be a better situation. Again, they play in the ACC. It's not like we're going to the Big Ten here, right? It's not like we're going to the SEC.
And their schedule is hilarious, by the way, if you haven't looked at it.
Yeah, you go ahead and read it out to people if you can.
Oh, I don't have it in front of me. I was looking at it the other day because I was talking to someone. They were saying, they're not sure on Cam Ward and Restrepo this year. And I was like, the schedule is like just a joke. They start off with Florida. They do, but I don't think this is a particularly good Florida team. And then after that, they have Florida A&M, Ball State, USF, Virginia Tech, Cal, Louisville, Florida State, a depleted Duke team, Georgia Tech, Wake Forest, Syracuse. Like there's no Clemson in there. There's no like this schedule outside of the weeks you like, okay, you just don't play them against Florida State and Florida. You probably can play everybody else on that team every other week without thinking twice about it.
I mean, shoot, I'd still play him against Florida. Florida's defense has not been great the last couple of weeks or last couple of years. So I
agree. Honestly, Florida State. I mean, I think they're going to be step back this year for sure. So I mean, it's a very easy schedule. And it's, you make a good point about this probably hinges on what's going on with Fletcher. Maybe their intention is, for all intents and purposes, to redshirt him. I believe it was a Liz Frank injury for him. I've seen. So, not the easiest thing to come back from. But I do think in terms of smaller backs, Chris Johnson Jr., Jordan Lyle, AJ Allen, like they do have a lot of those guys. So again, I forgot about Allen. Guess, if they don't think that Fletcher is good to go, then it makes a little more sense to me.
All right, we'll move on to the next one here. Penny Boone, running back out of Louisville. This is one of those situations where I was right not to draft Penny Boone. But again, not for the reasons here. I never thought in a million years that he would enter back into the portal after the spring. There's some kind of conflicting narratives here about why he's going back into the portal. There was kind of the main one that I buy was that Louisville hasn't been necessarily the most honest about their NIL opportunities in terms of that immediate impact that guys were going to see there. And that's why he's entering back in the portal again. Apparently, there is a NIL spokesman or part of the collective there that is intentionally telling guys to leave the portal because, Louisville's not ponying up for them. So I tend to believe that one. There's a lot of talk among the Louisville faithful that he was not a lot of people were drafting him as if he was solidified with the ones and that he wasn't solidified running with the ones. He was getting carries here and there, but he was not clearly the lead back, and that's why he's transferring. I don't necessarily buy that as much, but plays into my narrative for why I didn't want to draft him earlier. So part of me believes it on some level. But regardless, he's back in the portal. It doesn't really matter why he's there. It's just a matter of where does he go from here. Apparently, he's heard from a ton of schools. Again, Ole Miss, LSU, Tennessee, Miami, UCLA, Colorado, Oklahoma State. I have a picture on my notes here of all the different schools that he could end up going to. The main one so far is Washington. That's where he scheduled his first visit there. I think that school makes a lot of sense. Jonah Coleman's basically all they have at running back there right now, especially after Tybo Rogers is now suspended indefinitely there. So Austin, again, there's a lot of schools on our notes here, but of the schools that are listed there, which ones kind of potentially excite you? Or are you kind of like me where I don't really like him as long as he's going to a Power 4 school?
Yeah, there's always a little bit of, you worry about a guy that couldn't make it at a Power 5 initially, and you wonder how much of that was them and how much of it was just, maybe a log jam at the school they were at initially. He was at Maryland, he wasn't at Georgia or something where he was sitting behind a bunch of other future NFL guys. So that heading back up there worries me. I think Washington, I'm sorry, Washington fans, I think they're going to be one of the worst teams in the Big Ten this year. It's just tough to recover from what, that left this year. So that spot for our purposes would not interest me at all. Besides the fact that he's a starting running back. But this would probably be one where, if I had to choose between him and a guy like Dubar, who, if something happens and he becomes a starter, I'd way rather have a stash handcuff kind of guy over a guy that's going to get 18 carries, but it's 56 yards and you're hoping he falls into the end zone at some point.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, I can definitely understand that. Again, for the most part, I'm in the same boat as I was before I even got to Louisville, where it's if you're going Power 4, I don't really want to touch you. I'm not trusting a lot of, especially MAC to Power 4 transfers just have not worked out well for us over the last couple of years. So same rule applies here. Last name on this page here. Again, I already know we're running a little long here, so we'll get to this one pretty quickly. But Andrew Paul, running back out of Georgia, this is a guy that our recruiting team liked a lot. Shot up recruiting rankings near the end of his respective class. Tore his ACL in his true freshman year at Georgia. Got a little bit of run last year to the tune of 29 carries, 129 yards, and a touchdown. 2 catches, 14 yards, and a touchdown there as well. So a guy that, has had a lot of hype at Georgia, has looked pretty decent when he has been out there for the most part, but again, clearly still hampered by that injury. He kind of got buried a little bit behind Trevor Etienne, behind Roderick Robinson. Branson Robinson will be coming back at some point this fall. Again, I don't think he'll be a huge impact, but regardless, it's another body for him to climb over. It makes sense why he's in the portal. He's heard from a lot of different schools. I think a lot of people would be excited about for CFF purposes, especially a lot of the G5 schools here, like UNLV, or Ball State, Toledo, UTSA. I don't think he ends up at any of those schools. I think he's a talented enough guy to stay in the core 4. He's already planned a visit to Michigan State, which I think he would instantly find a role there. Again, Nathan Carter looked pretty good in the spring game this past weekend, but outside of Nathan Carter, the Spartans have basically nothing at running back, so I think he could go in there. If not, get the lead role at some point, I think he would easily be the number 2 guy there. Another school that's looking out for him is Oregon. I think Oregon would make a lot of sense there as well. But Austin, again, I got the list of schools there listed there. What are your thoughts on Andrew Paul, and do you think there's any way he could become a CFF asset this year?
Yeah, I was about to say, I think the interesting thing about him compared to these other 4 guys that we just talked about is that his timeline's a little different than theirs, either because of, eligibility purposes or just he does not have the momentum where if he doesn't continue that momentum this year, we stop thinking about him as an NFL guy. That momentum hasn't really started yet. I think he can think a little bit beyond this year when he's thinking about his landing spot. So as of today, I'm not treating him as if I'm just waiting for the landing spot to figure out where to draft him in a best ball or something. I'm probably I would be, happy, sure, if he does land someplace, but I think for him specifically there's some greater considerations on his horizon. And so it seems like based on the list of schools that he's looking at, he's aware of that. So I mentally am not treating him as a guy that I'm thinking I'll get something out of this year.
It's still crazy to me that easily the best transfer destination for him on the planet is a place that he cannot go because of how stubborn Dabo Swinney is. Like, it was between Georgia and Clemson to finish his recruiting. And Clemson, I don't care what some Clemson fans say, their running back room behind Phil Maffa is an absolute mess right now. Like, yeah, we like David Ezumame, or Ezumume, excuse me. Edamame is a dish. But David Ezumume, we like him coming in, but he's a true freshman, right? It would make all the sense in the world for Clemson to bring in Andrew Paul, be a clear number 2 back behind Phil Maffa for this year. But Dabo Swinney just, I don't know, man, like, it seems like he intentionally wants to sabotage that program by not taking advantage of a guy that you recruited super heavily and bring him in. It makes no sense to me whatsoever.
It's all about the culture, Jared. It's all about the culture.
Well, apparently he was good enough for the culture 2 years ago, but not now. It just makes no sense. Like, again, because like Kirby does the same thing, right? Where like a lot of the guys that Kirby brings in through the transfer portal are typically guys that he's recruited before, right? There's already an established relationship there. He doesn't want to take a guy that he's like, I don't really know about you. That makes sense to me. But when you're Dabo Swinney, you're just like, oh no, just no transfers whatsoever. I'm like, but they were good enough when they were coming out of high school. Why are they not good enough now? It makes no sense. Next round of running backs here. Again, these guys are probably a little bit quicker all here, but Javonte Citizen leaving Miami, kind of touched on him a little bit there. Ron Wiggins, the top returning running back out of Jacksonville State, only played in 6 games last year. Looked pretty solid in a couple of them. It had a 20-point game in week 9. Probably could end up being the top running back had he stayed healthy the entire year. Dallin Hayden, running back out of Ohio State, kind of a very similar situation to Andrew Paul, where transfers, injuries, just kind of buried him on the depth chart a little bit. Looked like he was set to get a big workload this year, but then Travion Henderson comes back. They bring in Quinshon Judkins, basically kind of screw him over, and he's like, you know what, afterwards, I'm getting out of here. He's got a pretty interesting list of schools that he's looking at. Isaiah Agasave, again, actually very similar situation between Hayden and Paul as well, where, you know, he's kind of stuck behind a transfer coming in and Quinshon Judkins, or not Quinshon Judkins, Jaquindon Jackson, and then you got Rashad Dubinion, who's also there at Arkansas, and so therefore, you know, you're stuck between a talented freshman coming in behind you, you got a transfer coming in that's ahead of you in terms of eligibility, so you just got to get out of there. And then last but not least, a blast from the past here, Alton McCaskill, former running back out of Houston, went to Colorado, did not play hardly at all. And now after seeing this year that he would not be the main back, he is headed out of Colorado as well. So, Austin, interesting list of names here. Who do you find the most interesting for this year?
Hayden is the guy that I find most interesting. And I wouldn't be counting on any of these guys, like, because you just threw in that caveat for this year, which really just threw off what my answer was going to be. But I think Hayden is leaving a school to find playing time, and so he's going to find playing time. Whereas some of these other guys, you know, Citizen, I think took him 2 years to come back from a knee injury. And he's reportedly probably really not still back. So that kind of tells you what we're working with there. I mean, I'll be honest, I'd be lying if I said I had many thoughts on Ron Wiggins from Jacksonville State, but I can't imagine that there's like intriguing schools calling him. So you're really down to Hayden, Augustave, and McCaskill. And I just think Hayden is the most well-positioned to kind of ride some height momentum to a school, to a situation that makes more sense for him. So I think I've actually taken Hayden in some best balls since the news broke. I think I've taken him twice in like the 20-ish round, or maybe a little bit later than that, as just like we'll roll the dice. He could be nothing, but if he goes and ends up even as like a second back somewhere, if something were to happen, I think I find him really, really interesting, because I think he's really, really good.
And like, look at this list of schools here that he is looking at. He's taking a visit to Colorado this week, which gross regardless. Again, I'm completely off the Colorado offense this year.
You're a deeply unserious prospect if you're considering Colorado right now, in my opinion, as an offensive skill guy, personally.
Yeah. Unless you're a wide receiver somewhat, but also like that
room is good.
I would say that room is super loaded right now. So like no reason to go there whatsoever. I don't want to go on a Colorado tangent, but I almost want to, because like it really blows me away how much Deion Sanders is setting up that team to somehow be worse than it was when he arrived. Because like, what's the quarterback plan for Colorado after Shador leaves this year?
Oh,
right?
I was gonna say that earlier. Like low key, I think Colorado would be a good spot for Rashada. Low key, I think it would be a good spot for him.
Because like again, like Shador's gonna leave, Deion's gonna go somewhere, right? Like some like I don't know who's going to take a shot on him, because again, I think that from my objective perspective or subjective perspective, I guess, I think he's leaving Colorado in a disaster spot because of how little he recruits, how much he's relying on the portal, how many guys transfer out after being there for a spring, let alone after a year. Like, I don't know.
Deion has done some good things for the school of Colorado in terms of, coming in there and bringing cash into the school.
Yeah, people care about Colorado now, which is like great and all, but in terms of the actual structure of that football team.
Exactly. So a school that would take him on would be a school, I think, that doesn't necessarily care, like does not have a rich winning history and can roll the dice a little bit. Is essentially a school that's very profiles, very similar to Colorado. I get Colorado has a natty or whatever, but I mean, they're not really relevant anymore. So yeah, I think a school like that, but I don't think he wants to. Like, I think if you look at everything that he does through the lens of, I'm just trying to get my son and this other kid that I call my son, who's not actually my son, instead of my actual other son, Shiloh. He's just trying to get those guys drafted. And if you look through that lens, like everything that he does just makes complete sense. And I think
for
that's
sure.
just what's going on right now.
And I think that's why a ton of people leave after a semester, because they realize like, okay, I'm not in the cool kids club. Yeah. He's not going to do what he's doing for Travis Hunter for me, or what he's doing for Shador Sanders for me. So like, why am I even here?
Yeah. So I don't think he will go. I don't think he'll coach somewhere else. I think he'll say like, oh, college football wasn't ready for me. This isn't.
I could totally see him retiring after this year. Like once these guys are drafted.
He's done. Yeah.
Anyway, back to Dallin Hayden, right? Because that's who we were initially talking about. But like, look at the schools that he's looking at here. Like, talking about Colorado, he's visiting Colorado, but also Auburn, Louisville, UCLA, Virginia Tech, Georgia Tech. Every single one of those schools, he can be on the 2 deep.
Yeah, 100%. Auburn would be really interesting.
I would say like Auburn might be the most intriguing to me, because I really don't think Jarquez Hunter is that interesting, or Auburn is that good.
Auburn, of all like those, like I think they're the kind of ticking time bomb offense that I'm most interested in this year. And yeah, I don't think Peyton Thorne is very good, but I think they have enough just like good players there that there could be a lot of scenarios where something really good happens there.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I find all those pieces are so cheap right now.
Oh, for sure. Again, Cam Coleman's going
for good reason. I mean, they haven't been particularly good, but I think, good offensive head coach that, I think that team is really, really interesting, and they're so cheap that I usually at best balls end up winding up with like somebody on that team, whether it's Jarquez Hunter or, you take one of these freshmen really, really, really late, like the 29th round or something like that. And I could see a scenario where Hayden goes there and runs for like 1,200 yards this year for sure.
I could see that as well. And honestly, like UCLA, right? Like, again, not saying that there is a rumor, but like, there's some people talk about TJ Harden. Apparently, like the coaching staff's been kind of hard on him this spring. If he leaves for whatever reason, I feel like Dallin Hayden commits to UCLA like the next day, right? Like,
eventually, UCLA is going to be bad.
I mean, they're going to be
bad, which is the other
like,
issue.
But like, look at the schools he's looking at: Colorado, UCLA. Like, these are schools that like. But he knows they're potentially going to be bad. He just cares about playing time more than anything else, it seems like.
Respectable.
All right, let's touch on the wide receivers here, and then eventually we'll get to some of these spring games. Good Lord, we're running long already. Again, the wide receivers, I would say, for the most part, it's a relatively, again, as the kids say, a mid group here. No like superstars or anything like that, but a lot of interesting names. Some guys that were being taken near the end of drafts. Probably the biggest CFF name taken out of this was Elijah Badger, leaving Arizona State. Justice Ross Simmons was also being drafted as well. Keandre Lambert-Smith, the top wide receiver there at Penn State, he is out and in the portal. Sam Brown, the top wide receiver at Houston, was the guy that people were kind of taking later on in drafts. And the last guy I'll throw out here, Tyler Williams, the wide receiver out of Georgia. This is not my Georgia bias showing through. This is more along the lines of like the rumor landing spot, I think, is something that people could potentially get excited about for him. But Austin, of those 5 names there that I just gave you, Badger, Brown, Ross Simmons, Lambert-Smith, and Williams, who intrigues you the most? I
think Badger definitely does. The rest of those names kind of strike me as like good good college players, but like maybe not necessarily interesting for fantasy unless like just the perfect landing spot crops up for them. But I think Badger is good enough to play at most schools across the country. I'd say probably 90% at least. And to be at least like the second best receiver on the team. So I think, send him to a place that just, he kind of needs that second receiver. And I think the nice thing about him is I think he can play inside or outside. So I think wherever you project him, you can kind of slot him in somewhere probably.
I would definitely agree. And the suitors, according to Chris Cartman, the Sun Devils beat writer over at 247, according to him, the suitors are rumored to be Alabama and Texas A&M. So Texas A&M, that's fine. I do think they need a little bit more help at wide receiver. Again, it sounds like Noah Thomas is really coming along there as their wide receiver one. I think Badger would provide a really solid second option there. Alabama is the one I'm most excited about. The potential of that got me excited enough to where I actively went into my CFF Dynasty leagues and started trading for Badger. I actually just completed a trade this morning to get Badger on my team. Gave away a couple guys like Chris Mitchell at Notre Dame and Arnold Barnes at Tulane. Just kind of buying low here because I know for a fact if Badger lands at Alabama, his price is going to shoot up. I think it'll be a higher price than what he was at Arizona State, given the fact that we know for a fact that Kalen DeBoer can support two wide receivers in a given year. And outside of Jeremy Bernard, there's nobody really there at Alabama right now that's stepping up and it's like, oh, that's clearly your top outside dude right there. They got a lot of question marks in that outside position there at wide receiver, and I think Badger would be a perfect fit to fix that.
My worry is that there's a lot of overlap with Bernard from a skill set perspective.
I guess that's fair.
I think that hurts one of them.
Potentially. But again, like you said, he's flexible. If he can like nail down that outside position while Bernard kind of stays in the slot for the most part, I think they'll both be fine. Couple of things here with like Sam Brown. The rumor is that he is headed to Miami, which makes a lot of sense given that his former offensive coordinator, Shannon Dawson, is there. Miami seems to be in need of a third receiver for the most part. Again, you got Restrepo, you got George. Isaiah Horton got a lot of love during the spring game, but you bring in a guy like Sam Brown, who would have been a top receiver at pretty much a ton of other schools. I think he makes an excellent third option for them. Could have some big games, a great best ball option, in my opinion, if he does land there, but not a guy I would rely on week to week. Justice Ross Simmons is interesting because the only two schools that I know for a fact are looking at him are Syracuse, because he scheduled a visit there, and Liberty, because according to Pete Thamel and Pete Nakos, they had like two completely different lists of who's looking at Justice Ross Simmons. And the only school that overlapped was Liberty, which, by the way, would be an excellent landing position for Justice Ross Simmons. Like him and Kaden Salter would be excellent. I think it'd be a great replacement for CJ Daniels there. But like some of the other schools that, according to Pete Thamel, that Ross Simmons is looking at, Vanderbilt, South Florida, Coastal Carolina, Georgia State, very much more G5 centric, very low P5. Pete Nakos went a bit higher, saying that like Washington, USC, Michigan State, Cincinnati, and South Carolina were looking at Justice Ross Simmons. So again, completely different lists there. Any of those schools strike you as exciting to you, Austin, if he does land there?
I mean, I think Liberty, like you said, is probably the most interesting. I do find Washington potentially interesting as well. I just think they're going to have to pass the ball a lot, so that could be fun. I'm hoping Liberty, because he's just been like an auto click at like round 22 every single best ball so far. So let's hopefully Liberty for my sake on that.
No, I agree with you. I have a lot of shares of Justice Ross Simmons. Keandre Lambert-Smith leaving Penn State. He has visits scheduled to Auburn, Texas A&M, and USC. Any of those schools strike you as something you would get excited about if you were a shareholder of Keandre Lambert-Smith?
I actually think that LSU would be awesome for him.
LSU?
Wait, did you say LSU?
No, Auburn, Texas A&M, and USC.
Oh, you said USC. Okay, I thought LSU would be a good spot for him. No, I don't like any of those spots, really. I mean, I think he's like a deep threat kind of guy. Mm-hmm. So I think any offense that just needs a field stretcher is where he'll do really, really well, which is why I think he's like a better college, like actual football player than like fantasy guy for stuff. I know our Penn State colleagues disagree with me. But I think he's interesting. But no, for fantasy, I'm probably not super interested there.
Yeah, and the last guy I'll talk about here is Tyler Williams. Again, potentially a little bit of Georgia bias coming out here, but again, the rumor is that he is headed to one of his old coaches down at South Florida. And that is a team that is in desperate need of a second option outside of Sean Atkins. They got a couple of guys that flashed here and there, like Naeem Simmons, but he wasn't really consistent there. Tyler Williams coming into Georgia was a guy that had just transitioned to wide receiver in his last year in high school, was still learning the position, and had a ton of upside if he could really kind of put things together and kind of nail down the intricacies of being a wide receiver. The problem is, in Georgia's offensive system, wide receivers are asked to do a lot. They are asked to process a lot of information on every single down that they are out there, and that is a tough ask for a guy that is literally just transitioning to the position in general, let alone a guy that has been playing the position for years. If Tyler Williams goes to South Florida, you are talking about the Alex Golesh offense. This is a simplified offense. This is the same offense that Josh Heupel ran at Tennessee, right? They don't ask their receivers to run a whole bunch of different routes. It is basically the same thing. Go and beat your man on every single play. That is a place where I think Tyler Williams, given his skill set, given his athleticism, could absolutely thrive. And, going back to the whole big fish, small pond, former 4-star wide receiver talent going to South Florida, I think it could be interesting if that is indeed where he lands. What about you, Austin?
Remember that offseason where USF signed Caffrey Brown and Joe? They kind of really tried to hit the P5 to G5 kind of guys. This has that stinky smell to it. No, I don't think Tyler Williams is very good. So no, I would not be interested in this at all, quite frankly. But
I will buy him cheap in every dynasty league that I can. Because again, like Sean Atkins is done after this year, right? If Tyler Williams goes down there and is the clear number 2 guy, like he's gonna skyrocket the next year. But who knows? We'll see. All right, that's enough of the transfer portal talk. Austin, I say we
one question for you, actually, Jared, that I wanted to ask real quick. So Golesh is such a good coach that I don't see him being at USF very long. Do you have a hard time buying long-term prospects at USF with that kind of in mind?
I mean, it's kind of the roll of the dice you make with any G5 team, right?
Sure.
Where if they have enough offensive success, enough teams know that, what's the old saying? Like, defense wins championships, but offense sells tickets. If you're a team that's looking to put people's butts in seats, you're going to go find the next G5 top-end offensive coach. You're right. Alex Golesh absolutely seems like a guy that could be gone within a year or two, but also like Byron Brown, right? Like he'll probably want to stick around for his development over there. Now maybe Byron Brown follows him wherever he goes, but I think it's a very fair point. Like, but it's the same deal you go with any G5 offensive coordinator, right? So
it is, and I don't know, like I would be less hesitant, like SMU when they were, now they're ACC or whatever, but they had some money to keep guys. Like I honestly just don't know what USF's like financial situation is at all. Like, could they pay Alex Golesh if somebody came and tried to hire him away? Like I legit don't know, and how many guys go with him. Like that's actually like a school like I'd probably buy for this year, but I probably like in a dynasty league I'm a little iffy about like looking forward beyond that.
No, for sure. It's the same thing with like North Texas, right? Where like Eric Morris has already had a P4 job before, technically at Washington State. Like if he does another successful year at North Texas, who's to say he's not gone next year? It's something you got to keep in mind.
There's a couple schools like that right now that I'm like, I don't really know if I care about this beyond this year. Like that could get a little dicey.
But the good news is that with the transfer portal rules now, pretty much all those guys can follow them wherever they go. So.
Sure.
All right.
But then you're asking Tyler Williams to go back out to a level that he already proved he couldn't do it at. That's just what makes me like.
No, I agree.
About some of these guys.
I agree.
So,
nope, it's a very fair point. All right, that's enough of the transfer portal talk. Again, I think we'll have more information, especially in terms of actual CFF impact for 2024. The moment that some of these guys start actually committing to different places. Now, the beat reporters and everything, and just the national types have been very good about talking about like, all right, who's actually talking to them, which has honestly been better than it has been the last couple of years. So we did have some areas where we can be like, okay, we like this school, we don't like this school, that's talking to him. But in terms of actual direct impact, we'll probably get that in the next coming weeks here. Let's move on to some of these spring games that happened this past week. And I'll be real, I underestimated the number of spring games that were happening this week. And I was like, oh yeah, transfer portal, a couple spring games, yeah, we'll be good to go. And then I'm like, oh shoot, there's like just like 20 good spring games that happened this weekend. So what's probably going to happen is Austin and I are going to cover 6 of the most interesting schools that we'll talk about here. Again, a couple of schools we haven't really been able to talk about on the show very much. A couple of big names. Again, you got, if you're watching on YouTube, you see Michigan on the screen. We'll get to them here in a second. And what's probably going to happen is I will record a solo podcast later this week where I do just a quick rundown of like the highlights of different ones. What are the impacts for CFF potentially moving forward? But for right now, Austin, I say we get started with Michigan here. Were you able to catch Michigan's spring game this past week?
I watched some clips of it. Yeah, I tried to educate myself on all 6 of these games just for you, Jared, so that you'd have me back on again.
Absolutely. But again, the kind of the main takeaways here were, again, the quarterback competition, not quite who we thought it was between. Again, a lot of smoke that Denegral was going to be a guy that was going to be involved, but it seems like Alex Orji and Davis Warren are the 2 quarterbacks here, and it pretty much is a tale of 2 different skill sets right here, right? Orji, very much in the mold of like a Jalen Milroe, right? Where he can kind of hit those downfield shots, but overall his short to medium passing game is very iffy at times. Again, he went 11 for 17 in this game for 95 yards. So not a ton of production there, but he can run. Is probably the biggest selling point for him is his legs. He had 1 carry for 18 yards on a touchdown. Clearly, they weren't going to run him a ton in the spring game because, you don't want him to get injured. Meanwhile, Warren is kind of the opposite. Less athletic, but man, he's a better passer. He went 6 for 9 for 142 yards and 2 touchdowns in this game. So, could be looking at 2 very different offenses for Michigan, depending on what we get by the time the fall rolls around, which makes me very hesitant to invest in anything regarding the passing game, whether quarterback or wide receiver here. It does look like that Tyler Morris is probably your wide receiver 1, whatever that counts for. Again, reminder, Roman Wilson, despite everybody saying like, oh, like pick him up off the waiver wire in the first couple of weeks, he finished as wide receiver 62 last year. It was hard carried by his crazy touchdown percentage. Like he had 11 touchdowns in the regular season on 40 catches. Like that's just completely crazy and never should be projected anywhere. But again, if you're just dying to invest in a wide receiver 1 from Michigan, probably Tyler Morris is your best bet there. The thing that was the most encouraging, that's the word I'm looking for, the most encouraging to me is that Donovan Edwards, while he only played 1 series, I think really did look better. And the fact that they took him out after 1 series, I think does kind of speak to the fact that they are going to rely on him quite a bit. I know a lot of us have been talking about, drafting Khalil Mullings, Benjamin Hall at the end of drafts, being like, oh, well, if Donovan Edwards kind of stinks it up like he did last year, like one of those guys could take over. All indications are this staff is going to ride on Edwards, ride or die. Like neither one of those guys between Hall or Mullings really seems set to overtake Edwards unless, injury happens. So it's kind of my takeaways from the Michigan game. What about you, Austin?
I don't think you could pay me to take anybody in this offense in a best ball outside of Orji at current cost. And even Tyler Morris, who is like free 50. I wouldn't do it. I have no expectations for this offense. I find Orji really interesting. He's just like the antithesis of everything that they've wanted at Michigan there. Like I just have such a hard time believing that he's the guy, but they've whiffed on their major quarterback kind of targets every single year for the past 3 years, which is how you end up with a competition of Donegal, Orji, and Davis Warren, who I legit don't even know who Davis Warren is. Like that's how you just and then Jaden Davis, the true freshman, who definitely isn't ready yet. So I don't want to. Donovan Edwards, if he ends up hitting this year as what is his ADP right now, like 3rd, 4th round.
Donovan Edwards is currently RB16 at the end of the 3rd round.
If I miss on that profile, I don't even mind. I legit do not even mind. I would rather shoot for guys that have similar upside a few rounds later, like, Jaquavius Marks or, because I think they're like similar kind of players and, attached to much better offenses. So no, I'm not interested in anything on this team. Nothing.
No, and I can totally get that. Like a very similar profile, I think here. Like who would you rather have? Donovan Edwards, RB16, end of the 3rd round, or Mario Anderson, RB26, like beginning of the 6th round?
Yeah, it's Anderson so easily there for me. I kind of don't like those like 3rd and 4th round running backs. Like I like the first 2 rounds and then I'll kind of skip the next round or 2 where Edwards falls and then kind of start hitting 5th, 6th, 7th round again. It seems like.
I'm kind of the opposite again. I love some of those like 3rd, 4th round running backs like Mekhi Hughes, LaQuint Allen, Malik Sherrod. I think I own a like in most drafts I have at least one of those three guys.
I do like Sherrod. So
But
I spoke too hastily.
But his ADP is going up a little bit, so it is. I've seen him go in the second round in a couple of drafts, so maybe again goes back to your point of like he's kind of separating himself. But again, for the most part with Michigan, again, mostly talking about them because again they are the reigning national championships. Big old asterisk. I don't really know how to say asterisks in a podcast format outside of just saying the word asterisk. I'm rambling now. But again, like there wasn't really too much to take away. It's not like Michigan's been like a great CFF system outside of the running back really the last couple of years, and really just boils down to it really does truly boil down to this point of do you believe in Donovan Edwards? Otherwise, you're not drafting anybody from this team.
Well, and you think about, they've whiffed not only a quarterback, they've whiffed at like a lot of other big targets too, outside of really a handful of running backs. And it's like they've developed a lot of really good talent. It's obviously why Michigan, won the national championship. They've taken some of these lower ranked guys, but they're all like defensive position guys. Like they really haven't developed a lot of offensive skill talent the past couple of years. I just don't think they've done a good job of identifying players that work in like modern college football from like a high-end production standpoint. That just hasn't been what they've been focused on. So I just think that's the state of the roster. They just don't have a lot of guys that kind of fit the profile of a player that I would say like he's capable of going out there and going, 80, 1109 through the air. I just don't think there's a guy on that roster based on current skill set that can do that.
I agree. All right, let's move on to another school here, and that is Oklahoma. They had their spring game this past week. We got our first look at the post-Jeff Lebby era with Seth Littrell now as the offensive coordinator promoted from within. Obviously, he's had great success at schools like North Texas in the past. And based on what we saw this past Saturday, it looks like things aren't going to skip a beat. Jackson Arnold looked great. 10 for 20, 233 yards, 2 touchdowns. Heavily reliant on his really only top wide receiver that was available on that day, and that was Deion Burks, who just absolutely stole the show. 5 catches, 174 yards, and 2 touchdowns. He looked phenomenal, and we've seen Seth Littrell's offense be incredible for CFF wide receivers in the past. You have to think that Deion Burks' ADP, I just can't speak today, man. I don't know what is up with me. But like currently, Burks' ADP is wide receiver 50. You're talking about like 12th round here. I would be shocked if his ADP didn't go up after this game. I know we're typically not supposed to buy too much into spring performances, and I'm about to explain why it's probably a mistake for him to go up too high here. But again, he looked incredible. Like, you just watch him, you can clearly tell that he is going to be a big part of this offense moving forward. They were hitting him down the field. They were hitting him close to the line of scrimmage. They're getting him touches in any way, shape, or form that they can. Now, I don't think you should expect 174 and 2 touchdowns on a weekly basis, or think that that's going to be his, or like I would be shocked if he had another 174-yard performance during the regular season. Because again, he was literally the only real option that Jackson Arnold had out there this week. Nick Anderson, Andrell Anthony, Brennan Thompson, Jarrell Farouk, all of them did not play on the day. And that's basically wide receiver 1 through 5 minus 1, wherever you fit in Deion Burks into that bunch right there, right? So it makes sense why Arnold would target him over and over again. But regardless, again, the spring reports have been good for Burks. So this is kind of a steady drumbeat situation where you heard good things. Now we see good things. Probably a good reason to be more okay with drafting him. I'm certainly going to move him up in my ranks just a little bit. But again, don't go too crazy with it, please, y'all. Austin, your thoughts on Oklahoma?
I just went and double checked to make sure. So I've done 5 best balls so far. I have Burks in 3 of them, and now I'm very upset because he probably is going to go outside of the range that I've been taking him in. I do like the question. Like, there are a lot of guys in this team that, mouths to feed, and I think that's the only thing that's going to hold him back, because I think if you use the nebulous term talent, I think he's the most talented wide receiver on that roster by like actually a pretty hefty margin. Mm-hmm. Like Brennan Thompson is like an athletic standout. I don't think he's a very talented football player. Like, I just looking at some of these guys, like I know Nick Anderson is just a really bad athlete. Like, I don't think he's a super talented football player. Like, I think Burks is the most talented guy in that room by like a lot. So he's going to go outside the range that I'm comfortable with anymore. I do think he's the best guy there. And if I had to just pick one of their guys in that offense this year, he is my favorite by a pretty hefty margin.
And I totally understand it, given what we just saw this past weekend. Like, clearly, again, they are going to use him in every way, shape, or form. And we talked about it last year, right? When he was at Purdue, when he was, again, his production was very inconsistent on a week-by-week basis. Like, he started off well, and then things kind of fell off. And so many of us were saying, like, get this dude on a real offense, and he could go absolutely nuts. Well, here he is on a real offense, and it looks like things are trending that way, that he's about to go nuts.
The play now maybe is you just hope that because of this game that Nick Anderson and those guys start to fall a little bit to another range where you start feeling comfortable scooping them up. And that might be what I'm keeping my eye on. That might be my real takeaway from the passing game here in this game.
Nope, I think it's a very good call. All right, let us move on to the other side of the rivalry here, other side of the Red River Shootout here, and that is to Texas. And I'm going to start this by, if you're watching this on YouTube, you kind of see the pose that Arch Manning there is doing, where he's kind of telling everybody, like, calm down, push everything down. Guys, we got to do this every time with Arch Manning, this discussion of, oh, y'all who are complaining about him being the number 1 overall recruit are eating your words now because he had a great day, 19 for 26, 355 yards, 3 touchdowns, just bombs after bombs. He looked really good. Guys, 2 things can be true at once, all right? 1, if Arch Manning's name was Arch Smith, he would not have been the number 1 overall recruit in his respective class. Truth number 2, he's still a very good quarterback. He, just based on the merits, would have been a 4-star, borderline 5-star quarterback, and was probably going to still be the crown jewel of Texas's recruiting class regardless. I am very happy that Sark did not listen to a lot of the boosters, did not listen to a lot of the people pressuring him to get Arch Manning out there. I think based on his level of high school competition, he was a dude that just kind of needed to cook in the oven for a little bit. And quite frankly, it might be a really good thing that Quinn Ewers came back another year to just kind of give that extra level of, or just give him that extra time to really kind of hone his craft and let Quinn Ewers go out there into the games, make all the mistakes, and then in his 3rd year, just absolutely come out and ball out. Again, he looks pretty ready right now, but who knows? Again, lots of touchdowns to a lot of our favorite guys. Again, Isaiah Bond had a long touchdown. DeAndre Moore had a long touchdown. Jadon Blue had a receiving touchdown. CJ Baxter had himself a short yardage touchdown in there. Again, overall, it was a great day. Quinn Ewers only played 1 series. He threw a pick 6, then called it a day. So not the greatest day for him, but again, pretty clear from the beginning. Ewers, they know he's a starter. They know what they got in him. He was not going to get a ton of reps that day. Manning came out, looked great. So, Austin, your takeaways from Texas?
I don't have a lot because I still think some of the pieces that would maybe make this a little more difficult, like, weren't really playing or aren't on campus yet. And you talk about a guy like Golden, who's kind of still working through whatever he's got going on with his injury. Like, I don't think he's really playing a ton right now. They don't have, Silas Bolden is not on campus yet. Like, so some of these position battles were like, I'm not sure that like DeAndre Moore's the guy in the slot. Like, yeah, the other slot guys aren't really available. So like, I don't learn anything from that perspective. I do think like if Quinn goes down, I think they're in a better spot than they were last year.
Agreed.
Because I think Malik Murphy stinks. And I think what Arch can do is a little bit different than what Quinn and Malik Murphy can offer. Where like, I think once Quinn leaves, this offense is going to be a lot more like option RPO heavy because I think he can run a lot more. Mm-hmm. And I do think that's going to make this offense really interesting. So it's like not a this year buy, but I actually like this. If you were an Arch believer before, I think this only solidified that in your mind. And I think if you were really doubting him based on kind of his spotty performance in last year's spring game, I think this, at least from like a fantasy perspective, starts piquing your interest a little bit because there's going to be talent around him and he can run. And he can maybe do this. So I think it was really encouraging from like a long-term Arch Manning perspective.
One last name I want to throw out here is true freshman Ryan Wingo. Again, not a guy that I think we can really expect to break into the starting rotation this year, given, again, the guys that they have with Isaiah Bond, Jonte Cook, DeAndre Moore, and everything like that. But Nate Marquise had quite a hot take, in my opinion, at least, on our latest episode of DTN when we were talking about some freshmen. He brought up Ryan Wingo, and he said that he thinks that we should be viewing Ryan Wingo in the same light that we were viewing Jonte Cook in last year for Texas. Again, Ryan Wingo in this game, 4 catches, 81 yards, 2 touchdowns. So clearly off to a very impressive start. There's been a steady drumbeat for him all spring. Austin, are you of the same mindset?
From the way the depth chart sets up, yes, I think so. From the way that, so the recruiting team, when a lot of the analytics people look at guys coming from college to the NFL and they say, yards per route run, yards per team pass attempt, like essentially trying to measure how efficient were you within the context of the offense that you were playing in, because that really matters, kind of taking that next step. If you're inefficient at a low level, it's really hard to believe that you're going to be more efficient when things get more difficult, is always kind of the drumbeat there. Well, Ryan Wingo, of all the top kind of receiver prospects we've charted over the past couple of years, outside of like Hakeem Williams, is basically like the least efficient guy that we've looked at in high school. And he wasn't playing like A+ competition. So you start wondering, like, if he was not efficient here, how much more efficient does he get when he gets to high school or when he gets to college? He wasn't even the most efficient guy in his own high school team. This was a really good showing. So there's no denying that. There also was, like, literally, from what I could tell, no defense being played. So I'm just very confused about what happened in this game. But I do think if you're just looking purely at the depth chart and you're a believer in the talent, then yes, like you have to believe that from his perspective, that he would compare from like a expected year 2 breakout. I'm just really skeptical long term because of those things.
Yep, totally understandable. All right, those are kind of the big names, spring games that we'll be talking about this week. We'll talk about a couple more interesting ones. Diving a little bit deeper on some teams we haven't really had a ton of time to talk about for CTN. Next one will be Mississippi State. This is a team that I will admit I was very skeptical on Jeff Lebby's ability to implement his system in year 1. Based on the spring game, based on what it sounds like in their spring practices and everything, it looks like that's where his major goal is just get the offense going in year 1. We'll figure out defense later. If we can get to an offense that is just threatening to score 40 points a game against any team that we face, that's going to put us in a pretty solid position at any given week. And again, it's looking great so far. In this spring game, Blake Shapen was just on fire. 18 for 22, 312 yards, and 3 touchdowns. And it really looks like that Kelly Akari and Kevin Coleman will be your 1-2 punch at receiver, and they separate themselves from the rest of that room. And that's pretty much a golden opportunity for CFF. Both Akari and Kevin Coleman go pretty late. So I thought I had their ADP written down, but maybe when Austin's talking, I'll look it up. But outside of them, there's nobody really behind him. The only guy that potentially, I think, threatened them was Justin Robinson, the former 4-star wide receiver who played at Mississippi State for a couple of years, but he's transferred out now. And so I think clearly Coleman and Akari are kind of the big 2 guys. We talked about already, this running game was very much missing some key pieces in terms of, having that bell cow back. Maybe Rashad Amos is that. Maybe they convince Damian Martinez to come there. Who knows? But that kind of sets up to me that, like, this is a team that's going to be behind a lot, and they're going to have to throw the ball a ton. And if Shapen is as accurate as he was today, and Akari and Coleman are clearly those number one and number 2 guys, I think you got a pretty solid CFF situation setting up for yourself here. So, Austin, your thoughts, man?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I just pulled up their ADP, at least according to CampusCan.com. Akari at 70 overall for the position, at 214th, overall, and then Coleman basically double that, 397 and 151. So I actually just took Coleman in the 26th round after yesterday's game. I think, I was skeptical. I just wanted to hear the names, some confirmation before I started clicking the draft button on some of these guys. But yeah, if you're flinging the ball around 40 to 50 times a game, something is probably going to happen from a fantasy perspective. I do worry that once they get put against not their own defense, that Shapen crumbles a little bit. I think that's a legitimate concern. I wouldn't get too crazy on these guys, but I think, I think there's still room there. If you take either of these guys in like around 60 is kind of that in that range, I think that's an okay spot. And then, later than that, I think, that's probably the ceiling of where I'd be interested. Yeah.
If you're taking either Akari or Kevin Coleman as like your fifth, sixth wide receiver, like, I think you're in a pretty good spot there. I'm hoping that their ADP doesn't go too crazy after the spring game here. Again, if they start getting up into the range where I'm having to draft them as a starter, like they're my 3rd wide receiver off the board, I'm going to get real queasy real quick about it.
I don't think they will, because I just think people view Mississippi State as just like this is like year zero. Like this isn't even going to be like year one. Like it's just a depleted roster, as we were kind of talking about earlier. So I don't think that the hype is actually going to. And Shapen's the quarterback who has been kind of not very good before. So I think that will dampen kind of the reaction to this. At least that's my assumption. We'll see.
But again, like maybe how much of that was just the Baylor coaching staff not being able to get the best out of him? Because clearly, again, he looked really good in this game. We know Jeff Lebby is a pretty good quarterback whisperer, so
for sure.
Who knows? Who knows? All right, let's move on to
just real quick, I want to toss out they brought in Michael Van Buren this offseason, right? As like their recruit.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in him now, even though, there really wasn't anything to see from him. Like just the fact this offense looked okay now, I'm like for college fantasy purposes, I think he's going to be really intriguing.
Oh, absolutely. And like as we mentioned with Kelly Akari and Kevin Coleman, they're in need of a third wide receiver there, right? Because again, Justin Robinson transfers out. That's kind of their safe third guy there. But I think the depth chart's wide open behind those top two guys. So could be an opportunity for Van Buren to step up.
He's a quarterback, but
I'm sorry.
Yeah. You're good.
I'm bad.
But I think like long term, I just think like that could be a great spot for him. I don't know how much higher Lebby's going to go than this. We'll see.
All right. Another school that we haven't really had a ton of time to talk about, but I think is very interesting. We got a lot of great information out of the spring game yesterday, is Syracuse. So again, there's really three different places that we can kind of go with this between quarterbacks, running backs, and wide receivers. I think probably the easiest first thing to do is just talk about Kyle McCord. Looked good, 18 for 28, 242 yards and a touchdown. Again, you're probably sitting there thinking like, oh, he only scored a touchdown. Well, Syracuse ran the ball in quite a bit, and we'll talk about the running backs here now. For those who've been drafting LaQuint Allen, I think you should be feeling really, really good. Scored 75 yards from scrimmage in this game, 2 touchdowns on the day. His backup is a true freshman, which obviously, ding, 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 if you're a C2C or CFF Dynasty League, like, LaQuint Allen's probably gone after this year in some way, shape, or form. And so I think true freshman Yassine Willis being his immediate backup is something to note there. And he is noted as the Thunder to Allen's Lightning. He will be heavily involved in the rotation, it sounds like here. And then lastly, the wide receiver situation. I don't know how much this team is going to pass this year. That's kind of my main thing. I'm like, it kind of holds me back here. But based on what we're hearing, it seems like this coaching staff is leaning towards having a set of 4 wide receivers that they are going to consistently put out there. Like the depth just doesn't allow for them to kind of run and rotate guys in and out a lot. This is a quote from the Rivals page for Syracuse. Quote, with the Orange running an offense primarily showing 3 wide receivers, a tight end, and a running back, it's easy to imagine their base set including those 4 receivers, referring to Aranda Gadsden in the tight end spot, Zeed Haynes in the outside spot, Hatcher in the outside spot, and then Jabor Pena being in the slot position. Continuing the quote here, Hatcher and Haynes would stretch the field on the outside, clearing space for Gadsden and Pena to work the shorter ranges from inside alignment and slot. Let's also make a note to call Gadsden what he actually is, a large wide receiver who lines up in the slot to get positive matchups against opponent linebackers or safeties. So even if this team doesn't pass a ton, like McCord passed for 28 times in this game, which is, again, I'd say pretty solid indication that, if you can get 25, 30 passes out of him, you can do pretty well. The other thing that was encouraging to me was the fact that Zeed Haynes and Trebor Pena, who McCord said earlier this week in an interview are the 2 receivers he has the best connection with, they got peppered with targets in this game. Zeed Haynes had 8 targets in the first half, including a 38-yard touchdown. He finished the day with 6 catches, 74 yards of the touchdown, and went on to win the spring game offensive MVP. Trebor Pena, for a slot guy, had catches of 23, 25, 25, and 50 yards. He finished the day with 7 catches for 130 yards. If we don't see a ton of rotation here, I do think that Zeed Haynes and Trebor Pena are guys that I am going to be pretty okay drafting in the last 5 to 10 rounds of a best ball draft. I think if they are guys that, they're out there every single offensive play, as long as, the starters are out there, they're probably locked in for 5, 6, 7 catches every single week. here. And I think they would make great PPR options here. Austin, do you kind of feel the same way, or am I reading way too much into this?
So this could just be the pure copium that I need to be huffing right now. I still think I'm only this is a good thing for Aronde Gadsden, who didn't play at all in this game. But it showed that this passing offense is going to be at least like competent. I'd probably, that's like the baseline for it. I think it'll be a little better than that, which I think is really good news for him. I'm having a hard time buying in on Pena a little bit just because he's been there for forever and hasn't really ever been super productive. And again, out of the slot, which is where Gadsden kind of plays a little bit. I think Gadsden being in there hurts him, but I do think Haynes could be interesting as a, like you said, kind of a late couple of round stash. But that's like my takeaway, which seems really weird. But I've been taking, as you know, and as we've discussed amongst our CFF group, Gadsden like round 7-8 is like automatic for me at this point. So I'm really hoping that means that he comes back healthy and, that he gets targeted kind of in the same way that some of these guys have been in that position.
I will throw out here for those of you who've been drafting kind of Dan Villery as like a late tight end option. Going back to the Rivals report here, they quote said, even with Gadsden available, tight end Dan Villery took on a minor role in the Orange offense, drawing only 2 targets. With these 4 receivers on the roster, again, going back to referring to Hatcher, Haynes, Gadsden, and Pena, it's hard to see Villery's offensive involvement, or it's hard not to see Villery's offensive involvement taking a major step back this year. So just a little word of warning for those of you who've been going out there drafting Villery as like a late option, like, oh, if Gadsden goes down, like he'll be back out there and everything. New staff, new priorities.
Well, that wasn't even where his value came from last year. Wasn't that the fact that he played Wildcat? Like
he played Wildcat, yeah, exactly.
So, yeah, and their schedule, just by the way, again, we were talking about schedules on here, like Ohio, Georgia Tech, Stanford, Holy Cross, UNLV, NC State, Pitt, Virginia Tech, Boston College, Cal, UConn, and then Miami for championship week. But I mean, like, good God.
Yeah, no, it is an absolute mess. Oh, by the way, Austin, you're on the clock in Best Ball 22.
Oh, thank you. I'm already in there. Okay. Let's see.
And while Austin's doing that, I will go ahead and introduce our last team we'll talk about here today. Austin and I had a good laugh before the show started because I told him, like, oh yeah, we're gonna talk about a couple of spring games for teams that we haven't had a ton of time to talk about, and then he immediately pointed out that I threw on Utah State again here. I wanted to throw in at least one G5 team, and I do think that there is something legit to discuss here because of the recent news we got with the quarterback transfers, right? We got Cooper Lega and McKay Hillstead, the 2 starters from last year, transferring out. And that leaves, who else but Spencer Petras, the former Iowa quarterback, now officially the guy to start. We got official word after the spring game that Spencer Petras is the starter heading into fall camp. So there's kind of 2 ways I look at this, right? The quarterback situation for Utah State was an absolute mess last year between Lega and Hillstead. They were rotating in and out, whether because of injury or because of them continuously throwing interception after interception. But the good thing that came from Lega and Hillstead is that they played effort ball a lot. And they were willing to take shots down the field to guys like Jalen Royals. You had Terrell Vaughn out there a lot. And because, again, going back to something I said last week, when you have bad quarterbacks, they tend to have tunnel vision onto their top targets. And so that benefited Royals and Vaughn a ton last year. But they're now gone. Spencer Petras comes in. So on one hand, I'm sitting here thinking like, okay, Petras beat out Lega and beat out Hillstead. That should tell me that that means he will be a better quarterback than what those guys were able to give us last year. But again, there's also the other side of me saying like, okay, but if he is the quarterback, he's playing safer ball. Means less probably downfield shots. Probably, again, more opportunities to score. Probably because you're not turning the ball over nearly as much, which could obviously be a very good thing. I don't know. I'm going back and forth in my head of like, what does this actually mean for Utah State and its offense moving forward? And I do think it's something that we have to discuss because of especially Jalen Royals' top 2 round ADP here. So Austin, how do you read this?
As I've been getting deeper into CFF, I think one of the exercises that you kind of have to do every offseason is you kind of almost have to forget everything that you feel like you already knew about players, especially when they're in a new landing spot. Was
Mm-hmm.
the last offense, the last, environment, the skill guys around them, were they conducive to producing, a successful player from a fantasy and real life perspective? So we were talking about this before the show. Like, in the back of my mind, do I think that Spencer Petras is probably not a very good, like, just not, we probably know that he's not really like a super highly productive college quarterback. Yes, I think that would be my answer if you just made me answer that question honestly. But if you think about, like, he was at Iowa, do we have a really good read? Like, everything that the Ferentz has touched from an offensive perspective, like, except for tight ends, just dies a horrible death. Overly conservative offense. Petras is 24. He could be one of those guys that kind of has that late career, just like highly experienced kind of breakout because he's been around for forever. We looked it up before the show. In high school, he threw for like 4,000 something yards his senior year, 50 touchdowns, and I believe 2 interceptions for a team that went 12-1 in California private school league and scored like almost 700 points in 13 games. Like, this is a guy who in the past has been a part of productive offenses. So I do think that he can come in here, give them something that's a little more consistent than what they got last year. Like, yeah, maybe it's not quite the tunnel vision guys, but I do think there are, like, if you want to look at this from like a glass half full standpoint, I think there are things to point to say that, like, this could be better than it was last year, which is good for the Royals, truthers, and then whoever else you want to point to, whether it's Freeman or whoever else is on this roster. I don't think that I would just, like, I think there are exercises that you can do to kind of say this could be a little bit better. Now, again, if you ask me, do I think Spencer Petras is bad? I would say yes. But I think there are caveats there, asterisks there that you need to consider.
And like the other thing to consider with Petras, right, is, again, like you said, he's in his final year of eligibility. This is a dude that has been literally locked, like kept in a cage because of Ferentz's offenses there at Iowa. It makes all the sense in the world. Why not go to a system that's going to be more open with his passing game? Actually let you play quarterback for once. And I think this absolutely could be a situation where he kind of goes to Utah State and is like, all right, I got one more year. Might as well try to throw up 4,000 yards and see if that's good enough to get me drafted. Because again, otherwise, there's like, if he went to another school and threw for like, I don't know, 2,300 yards, like there would be no shot that he would get drafted by the NFL or anything like that. I'm not saying he's going to get drafted even if he throws 4,000 yards, but there's a much bigger chance that he'll get noticed by somebody if that is indeed what his goal is. Or maybe
wasn't it announced that he was going to be a coach before he decided to play again this year somewhere as like a GA or something. So I think maybe he's already given up on that dream, but
could be.
I'm
going down narrative street here, Austin. Okay. So give me a break. Speaking of narrative street, I got to continue the pump and dump of Robert Freeman. There are certainly things that continue to point to the fact that Robert Freeman is going to be a factor for the Aggies this year, but got to be responsible here and let you know that there are a couple of things to note. One, Freeman did not show up until the 6th drive of the second team, which kind of tells you that there is probably a little bit of reason why, again, kind of going back to that report of the fact that he wasn't with the first or second team yet. But the moment he got on the field, in the first 2 drives he played, he was targeted 6 times. And according to CFB Nation, he was open on all 6 of those plays. According to Andy Pham, who is the writer for CFB Nation, who was there on site for the Utah State spring game, like, Freeman is just different compared to a lot of the other wide receivers out there. And the main thing that seems to be holding him back is grasping the playbook. Again, according to Pham, there were times where the quarterbacks, again, Bryson Barnes specifically, had to correct Freeman on where he was supposed to line up, what route he's supposed to run, and everything like that. So obviously that is something that is an issue and needs to be corrected if he's going to start for Utah State. But if he can get that, it's easy to see why he would climb the depth chart very, very quickly and quickly become a factor. Now, again, maybe I've been a bit too aggressive in the way that I've been drafting Freeman recently, given the fact that obviously there's things keeping him from running with the first team right now. But I still think he's probably the guy. If you're going to take a shot on a late round Utah State wide receiver, like, you got to go with him. You got any thoughts on Freeman, Austin?
I've drafted worse. He seems to be going a lot way earlier now because you've been talking about him and Josh Chevalier has been talking about him. And I don't know if Mike Bainbridge has been publicly talking about him, but I'm pretty sure Bainbridge likes him too.
I think Bainbridge was the first on him.
Okay, so there we go. So yeah, Bainbridge he's not going to pump and dump. He's going to try to keep that stock low so he can buy as much as he can. So, but he's going too early for me. I'm not interested at ADP. We'll see. Because again, like I said, if you ask me, I think Spencer Petras probably stinks at football. So like just be realistic here. Is there room for two people? I'm like two receivers. I'm not really sure.
There were last year. Terrell Vaughn was a top 15 wide receiver, and Jalen Rose was, I think, wide receiver 9. So like I think there absolutely is still room. Again, it as long as they do what they did last year, where it was Vaughn, Royals, and Davis just out there all the time, and they continue to be in this position where they have to chuck the ball a ton. So we'll see. Last thing I'm going to throw out here, again, I know we're going a little over time here, but I do want to throw out there a couple of major injuries that did happen this past weekend, just things to keep an eye on. Unfortunately, our number one player for CFF this year, Ashton GNT, did come up limping after scoring a touchdown in his spring game. I'll talk about the Boise State spring game in the next show a little bit, but no official word, but speculation is pretty much ranging on anything from a cramp to a hammy injury of some kind. So regardless, it seems like he should still be good to go for the fall, even if it is a hammy injury. Again, it's a spring game, so spring camp's done after this point. There's no more, oh, should he play, should he not? No, he's going to rest for a while. He should be good to go for the fall, but something to keep an eye on. A couple of ones that seem a little bit more scary. Ted McMillan left practice what looked like a knee injury. Again, no official confirmation on what that knee injury is, but something you got to keep an eye on. Probably hurts. Again, he's been going like 103, 104 in a lot of drafts. I imagine that probably pushes him back down just a little bit. Probably not something too crazy, but something to keep an eye on. And last thing here was a guy that was getting a lot of hype for Florida State, Malik Benson. Unfortunately, did have to be carted off the field during Florida State's spring game. Like I said, there's no official confirmation on what the injury actually is. Hopefully, fingers crossed that it's nothing serious. But anytime you're carted off the field, that's a pretty scary thing if you're drafting Malik Benson. So, Austin, any quick thoughts on any of this? Do you know anything more than I do?
Benson's the only one that I'm like worried about. Like I am just preparing for him to be done for the season mentally. They said that McMillan walked to the locker room by himself, whatever that's worth. I mean, we've seen, knee injuries where that happens, but I feel like if that's your star player wrapped in bubble wrap, if there was real concern, I don't know that they would have had him do that. So I'm cautiously optimistic on him, and Genti, I think, is fine.
Sounds good. Again, I just want to throw out that injury news here at the end just to kind of let people know. And it's an unfortunate reminder of the sport that we play, and guys do get hurt. So, alrighty. Well, with all of that being said, Austin, appreciate you coming on here. Do you got anything fun that you guys are working on coming out? I know with Campus to Canton, we got the Devi Guide coming out at the beginning of March. We got the team profiles from C2C Winning Edge from Nicholas and Allen and his team, putting all that together. The depth charts are going to be fantastic for people. Anything else going on with CampusToCanton.com that you want to throw out there to tease people with?
No, those are the two, imminent, I think, big things coming up here. And then, just everything else continuing to move on, ADP rankings, all that kind of stuff. So go ahead, go over and check it out. You didn't spiel this episode.
I spiel at the very beginning of episodes now.
Oh, that's right.
I spiel at the beginning of episodes now, just kind of get it out of the way as part of the intro. It works out really well now.
This is my first time being in here with you. Okay, so you just do it. Okay.
Yeah, I just do it right off the bat. But I do have an end of show spiel basically that I go through where I let everybody know we have come to the end of our show, and I thank everybody for listening. If you have not already, go ahead and leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you're watching this on the YouTube side of things. And if you're on the podcast side of things, make sure you follow the show and leave a 5-star review wherever you are listening, whether you're on the C2C podcast feed or the CTN podcast feeds. I will take 5-star reviews on either one of those. Make sure you guys check out the rest of the Campus to Canton podcast network for shows ranging on pretty much anything you can think of. Again, check out Colin's show for the campus side of Campus to Canton. We got Devi shows, recruiting shows, all that great stuff, everything you need for the college fantasy game. We'll see you guys back here later this week. Again, I'll record a solo show kind of covering over some of these other spring games and takeaways we have from those. Until then, really appreciate you guys and I hope you have a wonderful and blessed week. See y'all.